Alegra, welcome to Revealing the Beast. How are you
Hi,
doing?
good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to talk about OCD with a
Mhm.
therapist, a mental health advocate. I think it's a very important subject, something that a lot of people don't know a lot about, including myself. So I'm excited to hear your journey and your story with it. But first off, how are you doing? Where are you calling from, and how's everything going on your end?
I'm good. So I'm calling from New York. I just moved here 3 months ago, and it's been really fun. I'm actually doing a Gatsby housewarming party tonight. Obviously, very small because of COVID, but I'm excited about that, and things are good.
The Gatsby housewarming party. That sounds exciting.
It's going to be very exciting. I'm doing like a champagne tower.
For real? Dang, I miss
I,
parties. This is something that,
I'm going
oh my
all
gosh.
out, all out. I'll have to send you photos.
Everything that I do, when everything opens back up, everything I do is going to be super extra. Every
Oh yeah,
birthday party, every
gotta
gathering
be.
is going to be extra.
Yeah, because it's been so long.
So I'm really excited to hear your story. We've been going back and forth. You're like, yo, are you ready for this? I'm like, yes, I can't wait. But I'm even more excited to learn about OCD because I think a lot of
Absolutely.
people would like to know what it really is. So you're a therapist, you're a feminist, you're an activist, an
Mhm.
OCD advocate. I want to get into all of that. But first of all, can you explain to me and to us and tell us what OCD is?
Absolutely. So there are so many misconceptions about OCD that make it really difficult for people who actually suffer to understand what they're experiencing. And that was what happened to me when I was struggling. I had no idea that the symptoms that I was experiencing were related to OCD because everything that we hear about it is typically like this person washes their hands compulsively, which can be a thing, or this person loves organizing, like Khloe Kardashian did her whole like CD thing. And it's just not what OCD is at all. So, OCD, like real and true OCD, there's the obsessions portion of it and the compulsions portion of it. So, the obsessions is really like intrusive and unwanted thoughts that repetitively pop into someone's mind and really disturb the person experiencing them. And people can have obsessions about anything. They're often about like taboo subjects like sexually intrusive thoughts, violent thoughts, like religious obsessions. And it's like the last person or the last thing that somebody would ever want to think, but it just keeps popping into their mind and they can't stop thinking about it. So then, because the thoughts are so scary to the person experiencing them, they try to perform compulsions to get rid of the thoughts or to neutralize them or get rid of anxiety. So it's very unwanted and it's very distressing to the person. Whereas everything we hear about OCD is, oh my gosh, I'm so OCD. I love to organize. And it's not like that at all. If someone has OCD, they're really, really struggling.
Can you tell me how OCD affects you? Like, how does it affect you? Can you give me examples of what kind of intrusive thoughts or mental compulsions you face?
Totally. So this is where it gets harder in terms of sharing. So, oh man. So, where do I start? I guess when I was 19 years old, I had never really experienced this before. And I remember I was working at a clothing store and I just had this thought pop into my mind. And it was the scariest thought of my life. I guess I'm just going to go all in with this. It was like a thought, there was like a child that walked into the store, and I had the thought, like, what if you want to have sex with that child? And it was the scariest thing I've ever experienced. But like, it felt like from that moment on, my brain just like my brain broke. Like I like the thought just kept popping in and popping in and popping in. And it was obviously nothing that I wanted to be thinking about. It was so opposite to my values, which OCD is. And I mean, it was like living in a nightmare every single day because you can't escape your brain. And for me, like the obsessions I dealt with were sexual obsessions. So like my thoughts, I would literally have like sexual thoughts about family members, about dogs. And they were so petrifying. Like, this wasn't something that I enjoyed. And that's also like what makes it OCD. It's literally the last thing that you want to think about, but it just keeps popping into your mind. And all of my compulsions were mental. So nobody would have seen that I was suffering. And I didn't even know that I was suffering because we don't hear about intrusive thoughts being related to OCD. I thought I was just like a terrible monster. And it took me probably 2 years to like get treatment and recognize that I actually had OCD, which is really short for a lot of people. It's typically like 10 to 15 years.
I'm sure having these thoughts was really hard. Was there a part of you that felt some kind of relief when you were diagnosed to say, okay, there is something that I have to deal with, and this is a condition that I have to
Yeah,
figure out to heal?
there was relief for sure. I mean, OCD is the doubting disorder by nature. So I saw it, okay, this is OCD, but still part of me was terrified that it wasn't. And I can't express enough like how much intrusive thoughts and obsessions are so opposite to like a person's core values. Like, I've always loved kids. I knew I was born to be a mom. So when I started having these obsessions, it just like, it didn't feel like me. I honestly thought that I was experiencing psychosis. I wasn't. I was just having intrusive thoughts, but it just felt so opposite to everything that I knew about myself. Like, in the past 19 years of my life, this is when I was 19. But yeah, I mean, I felt relief for sure, but it still didn't take away from like the pain of having to live with that every single day.
Wait, you said the past 19 years, as in add 19 to 19?
No, sorry. No, I meant
Oh, I was
like,
gonna say, no way, what?
no. So 19 is in like, it didn't, what am I trying to say? I don't know. I forget where I was going with that. But no, okay, this is what I meant. Everything that I knew about myself when I was 19, like the thought that popped in when I was at that like clothing store was so opposite to what I knew of myself. Like, that was not
Oh,
anything that I wanted to be thinking about. I'm not attracted to kids or dogs or family members. That's like what I'm trying to say is it scares the person so much because it's literally so opposite to who they are.
so I kind of want to dive a little bit just to understand. So you have this thought. I know friends and family members, or even myself, I have moments where I have some thoughts of, I wonder what would happen if this person came in here and killed everybody right now. What
Yes.
would happen if, these kind of crazy thoughts? How do you then distinguish? And like some of these are kind of extreme, right? Like a little kid, a dog. What
Yeah.
happens? You said your brain was broken. What is that? Paint the picture more for me so I can
Okay.
understand. Like
That's a really
what
good
happens?
question. So OCD is very biological, meaning that when somebody experiences it, like when they first have, let's say, the onset of OCD, they were genetically predisposed to it. So I think at some point in my life, this would have happened. It just so happened that it happened when I was 19. But the OCD brain is wired differently than the brain without OCD. So you're right in that we all get intrusive thoughts and we all have thoughts that are kind of like, well, that was weird. Why did I just think that? But somebody without OCD can, like, they can just brush it off as a weird thought and move on with their day. The person with OCD has a very sticky brain because their fear center in their brain is so hyperactive. So the thoughts stick. They can't just stop thinking about them. It happens repetitively. Like, for some people, it literally is 24/7. Like, just thoughts popping in of like the scariest thing ever. And
So
then you
you
also have,
stay. Oh, sorry. Keep
oh, what
going.
were you gonna say?
Now I was gonna ask if when a thought pops in, you're staying on that one thought, or you're going to other different things.
I mean, it could, for some people, it repetitively plays on that one thought. For others, it could be a million different things. Like, you can have phrases pop into your mind. So it really just like, you have no control over it because obviously we can't control what pops into our mind. And it's like, for the person experiencing it, in terms of like what makes it OCD, there's impairment in the person's functioning, and the obsessions and compulsions take up at least an hour of the person's day. So it's not just a passing thought that someone has, it's like something that is very disturbing and it is time consuming.
Does it limit you, your ability to perform during that day, during that in that moment when you're having these thoughts?
It doesn't now because I am in recovery, like what I consider to be in recovery. But when I was really struggling, I mean, it destroyed my life for sure. Like I just had to stop school because I couldn't like focus. I couldn't read because every time I would read, a thought would pop into my mind and it would terrify me. I couldn't sit in class. I didn't like to be around other people because I didn't want to have thoughts about them. So it impacted me like very deeply, and I didn't ever think I would get to the place that I am now, for sure.
So you have this thought for the first time and it starts going through, and you go through your, your young adult years. At what point do you get to where you're like, okay, I need to seek help, or I need to, how does paint that, or walk me through that journey a little bit?
Oh, I feel like I'm gonna cry. It got to it got to a point where I like didn't think I was gonna live. Like I just couldn't um I couldn't live like with these thoughts anymore. And I thought to myself, like, I need an answer now, or like this is gonna be it. And I know suicide is like very triggering for people, but if I didn't get help when I got help, I honestly don't know that I would be here.
Well, first off, thank you so much for sharing this. I know that it's really hard to go back to these places, these traumatic places, and so I'm grateful. The point of this is, I know there's somebody out there. There's probably another 19-year-old who had a thought pop in
So
their heads today,
so many. Yeah.
and so I'm hoping that this is an outlet for them to where they understand that they're not alone, and whatever tools that you use along your journey and your story can help them as well. How did you learn to cope? So let's go to the healing part of it. What
Healing.
was the first step to help you?
Therapy for sure. Therapy changed my whole life, and it's a very specific kind of therapy. So, a lot of mindfulness work, like learning to just accept the presence of your thoughts, because I mean, you're not in control of that. Not fighting with the thoughts was a really big tool for me because a lot of people with OCD do fight with them. It's like the last thing you want to think. So you try to suppress your thoughts, you try to get rid of them, and it just makes the OCD worse. So a lot of acceptance work of just like accepting that my brain is going to produce these thoughts and that's okay. I don't need to do anything about them. They don't mean anything about me. And I had two different therapists who both played a really big role in my journey. So therapy was the healing for sure. Therapy and
My
medication.
and medication as well.
Yeah.
My experience with therapy, I there was this stigma around it in my head until I tried it for the first time, actually, when I was in college. I was dealing with a lot of anxiety. I just started playing basketball, and I was used to playing in front of 30 people, which five of them and 10 of them were my family, to go
That's
into college.
amazing.
you know, and then I go to college because I was only playing these travel tournaments, and then I get to college and I'm playing in front of 5, 10,000 people, and I just didn't know how to handle that. And so my college coach got me a therapist, and he was able
Wow.
to talk me through the scenarios in my head, and it broke down that wall for me because I didn't know how
Yeah.
important it was. And since then, there's so many friends, so many people, so many successful people who talk about it openly. Like,
Yeah,
listen,
for
I wouldn't
sure.
be, yeah. Even Michael Jordan said that one time. It's like, I wouldn't be this guy talking about his therapist, he said he saved my life after he lost his dad and he had to come back to playing basketball. I guess my question about therapy is, if there's somebody who's dealing with it, what are the steps? How do you find a therapist that works for you? How did you find a therapist that worked for you?
So, okay, so I'll answer the second question first. I didn't even really know what therapy was growing up. I didn't know that it was a thing. My family didn't talk about mental health. And there were other things I struggled with growing up, like eating disorders and anxiety, but I just didn't know that something like that existed. And it got to a point where I was working in the PR industry, and I was very successful, I will say. Like I was high functioning when I was struggling, but I would like go to the bathroom at work and cry, or I would like walk outside for 5 minutes and cry because I was just in so much pain from the intrusive thoughts. And I had a colleague one day, I think she came outside and saw me like crying again. She grabbed her phone and was like, Allegra, like, I'm done. Like, you really need to get help. She called her therapist, and then she asked her therapist for a referral for me. And that therapist ended up calling me, and that was my introduction to therapy. So, really, just by a friend who had been going to therapy and just saw that I was struggling and said, like, you really need to get help. And then for OCD specific therapy, I like did a lot of research because there's a certain kind of therapy that works best. So if someone's looking for, let's say, therapy for depression or therapy for anxiety, Google literally therapy for anxiety, because there are certain therapeutic modalities that work better for certain conditions.
You guys are hearing it from a therapist herself. So if she's telling you go Google, because I get scared to Google stuff. If I
Well,
Google any kind of
it's
health
hard.
condition, I feel like I'm definitely dying tomorrow. So like,
Okay, I take that back. I take that back. Don't, okay, Googling is bad. Googling is bad. But I feel like finding a therapist that specializes in your diagnosis is really powerful. That's like the most helpful thing. Because a lot of therapists will say, I specialize in OCD. And they actually don't. They list OCD as one of the 20 different conditions that they treat. And a therapist just doesn't treat 20 conditions. It doesn't work like that. So find someone who really specializes. Like I specialize in a few different conditions, but I do not treat everything. And I make that very clear.
I also say this about therapy. A lot of people try it once and say, well, this it didn't work this time. And I want you to also understand that there's different therapists for different people. Like it might not be a match for you. The person
Oh,
could be
for
the
sure.
yeah.
I had a
And
couple who were not a match for me. Like, oh God, Philip. Yeah, I had a few that I had to nix. It wasn't working.
so make sure you find somebody that works for you. I got my question though is, mental illnesses they're invisible for others on the first
Yeah.
glimpse, right? Do you feel like you need to explain yourself a lot because of that?
Um, so with OCD, kind of, because every time I say to someone, like if I'm saying, I work with OCD, or they ask why I specialize in the treatment of it, I feel like I always get something like, oh, but you don't look like you have OCD, or, I have OCD too. I love to organize. And it just like, they don't understand. So I do feel like I'm having to explain a lot. But it's hard to. I was honestly really nervous to explain like just like what I explained about my own OCD to you, because normally I talk to people who are in the mental health field. So I feel like they have somewhat of an understanding, but it's really scary to open up to somebody who isn't like a therapist or doesn't work with mental health, because like I run the risk of someone thinking that I'm actually just like a terrible person instead of someone who's just having unwanted intrusive thoughts. So I feel like
I
there's a
think that
lot of explaining.
yeah. So the point of this podcast and the point of even this platform at all is I want more understanding. I think that a lot of people go through a lot of things on their own, and yes, I might not be a mental health advocate or anything of that nature. I want to be, but I want to be somebody who listens first, and I understand other people what they're going through before I can make a decision on whatever it is going on in my life. And you never know, I might learn something about my own life while we're talking as well, which I have a lot, you know. Um, but OCD has always been used as an adjective, right? I watch these different shows. I watch Monk. I watch The Good Doctor. I think it's a Good Doctor, where people are, they're trying to be extra tidy and try to keep things clean and organized. What's your take on that view of OCD?
I think it comes from the like OCD can be how do I say this? OCD can surround contamination, and I think that's kind of where like the myths come from. Like someone can have obsessions about germs or cleanliness, but the thing that people don't understand is that if someone does have, let's say, intrusive thoughts about contracting, I don't know, germs from touching a doorknob or whatever it may be, they will wash their hands compulsively because they feel like they have to. It's not something they want to be doing. It's not something that they enjoy doing. And I think people look at that and think, oh my gosh, this person like washes their hands a lot. They must love to be clean. It's not like that. They feel like they have to wash their hands or they're going to contract a deadly illness. So I think it comes from like the contamination obsessions, which are actually a very small part of what OCD can manifest as.
This next question, you kind of answered it already, but I'll ask it anyway. You're very vocal on social media,
Yeah.
and that can help so many people. But I know from my own personal experience that it's not always easy being open and
So
vulnerable.
hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You ever struggle with sharing personal aspects of your life?
Yes, for sure. I think what I've struggled with recently is I feel a lot of the time that everyone has something to say. And don't get me wrong, I think like I try to be the most inclusive that I can, and I really try to make my page like a home for everyone. But I've struggled recently with like any little thing that I put up, someone is upset about it. So that's been difficult for me to be inspired to share because I just it's so exhausting to receive like the comments and the DMs and stuff. So that's been more of what I've been dealing with recently. But it was difficult to start sharing about my journey with OCD because I didn't want to receive comments like you're a monster, you're a terrible person, because that's literally what people with OCD fear the most. And it's what keeps people from sharing on social media. Like there's just not enough education about OCD in the way that I experienced it because who wants to talk about that? It's terrifying.
Well, first off, congrats on 50K on Instagram.
Thank
That's a
you.
big yes. But it's a I know it's kind of silly because it's Instagram and social media, but I feel like that shows that people are gravitating to your realness and your vulnerability, and they're either getting knowledge from it or they are feeling seen by your voice. So I just want to say congratulations because we need more people out there who are using their stories to help people. So thank you for that, first of all.
Welcome.
There are so many areas of life that OCD affects.
Yeah.
Like I read on your Instagram that it can affect your sleep, it can
Oh,
affect
yeah.
dating and even sex.
Yeah.
To be honest, I didn't realize it was such a 24/7 thing.
It's yeah, it's constant for people. Yeah, it's constant, it's debilitating. And I mean, think about it. Like, imagine you're having sex with your partner and these thoughts about like fucking a family member pop into your mind. Like, it doesn't make for an atmosphere in which you want to be having sex. So, a lot of people will avoid having sex because they're so afraid of having the obsessions pop in. I mean, yeah, I feel like you were going to ask something and I just jumped in.
No, that was it. That was my, I just that my observation was I didn't realize that you have to constantly deal with this because
Mhm.
it's something like sex that usually has the person's attention all the way. You
Mhm.
still have the wherewithal to think about something else and be distracted from it. And it take you away from that experience. That's got to be hard.
It's so difficult. And it's really hard because acceptance is ultimately like acceptance of the fact that you're having thoughts, not accepting the thoughts as truths, is one of like the biggest keys to recovery. But so many people fight that because they don't want to be having these thoughts. So it's kind of like you are literally living with a brain that is just like constantly feeding you with scary thoughts, and you're having to go to work and talk to your colleagues. You're having to, go to your wedding day and have these thoughts. Like people don't get a break from them, and they pop up in people's dreams too. That happened for me. So it feels like you can't even escape in your sleep because the OCD pops into your dreams.
There's you said something earlier about mindfulness. That's
Mhm.
something I recently discovered over the last year or so. Meditating, reading, journaling, all these things that keep you in the present moment and just help you accept whatever it is that you're going through. How have these, maybe go into it a little bit more
Yeah.
about how they helped you and what practices you use.
Totally. Mindfulness changed my life because mindfulness is all about non judgment. Like, we don't look at thoughts as good or bad. We don't look at feelings like anxiety as good or bad. We simply notice what is. I'm having this thought, I'm having this feeling. And that was really crucial in my own recovery with OCD because I could start to observe my thoughts without responding to them and without fighting with them. So I got to a point where I would say, okay, there's that thought again. I'm just going to continue on with my day. And when you stop fighting with your thoughts in that way, they stop fighting with you. You typically tend to have less of the intrusive thoughts over time. And mindfulness also keeps you in the present moment, which is really hard for someone with OCD. They're often performing compulsions in their mind. They're trying to figure out if something bad is going to happen. So I like that mindfulness is very much focused on what is happening now so that the person isn't mentally compulsing.
I think that even if you don't have OCD, we all have these compulsions, right? Because when you're angry, you get into, and I'm just giving a random example now of you get into a fight with somebody, your partner at home, and then you go to work. You take that with you because somebody can easily tip the scales. Somebody could say something to you that could tip the scales, and you just get into anger. But with meditation, with mindfulness, with all these different practices, you can you're able to watch these thoughts go by. I thought that that was really interesting that you said that, and it's something that
Yeah.
I'm myself as well.
Yeah, you just non-judgmentally observe them, and then you get to decide, is this a thought that I really want to pay attention to or not? Some thoughts are helpful to pay attention to. OCD obsessions, not helpful to pay attention to.
Has your journey to recovery, was it linear, or was it like something that just went straight up, or did you have times where you slipped
Yeah.
off, and how does that go? Maybe paint that picture a little bit too.
It's never linear. And I'm so glad you asked that because so many of my clients expect it to be linear. They have a little lapse in their journey and think, this is it for me. Like, why isn't it just straight to the top? But it doesn't work like that. It feels so long ago now. I feel kind of removed from it, but I had a ton of dips along the way. It was definitely not linear by any means. And oh goodness. Yeah, I don't even know how to answer that question, but it was not linear for sure.
Tell me about your journey to becoming a therapist, because
Mm,
now you're taking your
okay.
story, your journey, and using
Yeah.
that to help other people.
So it was never something I considered. Like I always wanted to be in the PR industry. I thought I was going to do that forever. And when I initially like was struggling with OCD, I sought out therapy. I found my therapist Lori, and she honestly changed my entire life. Like I don't know that I would be here or at least be who I am today without her. And she really inspired me to want to become a therapist and help others in that way. I didn't think I was going to work with OCD at first because, like, to me, I had already experienced that 24/7 every single day. I did not want to, like, enter a room with clients and have to hear their obsessions. But over time, I was so passionate about advocacy and education. And I really just thought, I have this unique experience that I would never wish upon anyone, but it can also help other people. So I may as well specialize in this. And that kind of pushed me to specializing in the treatment of OCD.
I have two brothers who are psychology majors. They just both graduated from college. So they are kind of on the same track of using their stories and their journeys
Yeah.
to heal people. So I really respect that so much.
Thank you.
Um, I have one, maybe for those people who are experiencing it right in the moment and they don't have access to a therapist in the moment, right? Like you're in a meeting and these things start coming up. Do you have tricks? Do you have tips? Do you have things that you do to help yourself just stay centered, stay in the moment, or
Yeah. I say this a lot, but I will say it again because it's the most powerful tool. Acceptance or allowance is going to be your best friend if you're experiencing something like this. Allowing the thoughts to exist. Because we have a million thoughts every single day that we don't really pay attention to. We can have the thought and move on. These are just so scary to the person that they pay a lot of attention to them and they overvalue them. But allow them to exist, do your best to stay present with what's going on, and it's going to be a lot easier. I mean, it's not easy to practice acceptance, but that is ultimately how someone's going to recover, along with therapy. Yeah,
acceptance is hard for everybody.
it's
It's
so hard.
it's a
Yeah.
journey. Tell me about your Center for OCD. You founded a Center for OCD,
Yes.
anxiety, and eating disorders. You
Uh-huh.
also write for Psych Today
Mhm.
and very well.
Yes.
Congrats, those are huge accomplishments, by the
Thank
way.
you.
Tell me about that, and has that as helping others helped you along your journey as well?
So much so. Yes. When I was in the PR industry, it didn't feel very meaningful for me. And I kind of just felt like I was helping people in a very superficial way. And now I feel like I am helping people honestly survive. There's a really high suicide rate with OCD because of how distressing it is for people. So when I sit with clients and I get to help them recover and watch them on their journeys, it means the world to me, for sure.
Your center, is it in New York as well?
Yes. I actually see clients all over the world and everything's virtual right now. But I have clients in like Hong Kong, Australia, the UK, California, and I'm just doing it all via Zoom.
I want to know how can people find you? Maybe social media handles and whatever it is that you give out to help
Yeah.
people contact you.
So my Instagram would probably be the best way, at obsessively ever after. I try to respond to DMs, but I get so many that I don't always respond. Or you can go to my website as well. There's a contact form. It's just allegracastens.com.
Okay. This is my favorite question. It's usually my last question. If you look back to the 19-year-old, or maybe even before that, but that was the first instance. If you could talk to her, if you could talk to young Allegra, your younger self, what would you say to her?
Oh, I'm gonna cry again. What would I say to her? Oh man, I would tell her that she has OCD for sure. I would give her that name instantly instead of having to like white knuckle throughout life for a few years. And I would tell her that it's going to be okay, that you're going to have a really big life and you're going to be happy again. Yeah, just that things are going to be okay, even if they don't feel like they are now.
That is always my favorite question because that's the reflection that for a lot of us, I think even for me, like I think about that question all the time. I think about talking to my younger self, like, wow, because when you start thinking about the things that you've been through and the things you've overcome, wow, you really are a beast. And I just want to say I'm so grateful that you agreed to share your story with me. Share it with anybody who is listening. I'm sure somebody out there, you're going to touch somebody and help them keep going on this journey. So I really appreciate you. Welcome back. You know what? You know what this is gonna be? It's gonna be a two-part series. Actually, I think I'm gonna add this to the end of the other episode. But this is really cool because after we got done, we listened to the cut and we felt like I also felt like definitely had more questions. Had
Yeah,
more questions about your story, had more questions about the therapy and the treatment of OCD. So
absolutely.
thank you for agreeing to come back and run
Mhm.
it back.
Yeah.
Um, so last time we talked about you discovering at a young age at 19, I think it was,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
19 years old is when you had the diagnosis, or you had the symptoms.
Yes, the symptoms, no diagnosis yet.
Yeah. And so is that typical? Is 19 a typical age for people to discover that they have OCD?
It's such a good question. And honestly, I think a lot of people figure it out around that time. It's either like 12 to 13 years old or 19 years old. It's not everybody. Like I've had clients who didn't start having symptoms until they were 55, but
Wow.
19 seems to be an age where a lot of people have that first like manifestation of symptoms.
That's got to be tough to go through a whole life. And at 55,
Goodness.
the whole half of your life, and it's like I've been struggling with this thing, and I finally get a diagnosis that this is something that can be treated, and it's something that I should be
Yeah.
working on, rather than something being like truly, truly wrong with me. With some of the thoughts that we.
Totally. And it's hard for people who are older. Like I'll get DMs from people in their 70s or even 80s saying, I wish this information was out there 60 years ago. And I wish there was proper treatment because they've just gone their whole lives struggling.
Tell me about your diagnosis and the way that how were you able to figure out, how was the therapist able to figure out that it was OCD in itself?
Yeah. So I feel like a lot of that time is honestly like a blackout to me. I don't even remember my first therapy session, but I remember like at the end of it, her saying, like, you have OCD. She was very clear in that. And she just knew that that's what I was experiencing. And I didn't fully believe it myself for a little while because I mean, we hear so many things about OCD and it just didn't seem to fit for me. But she diagnosed me for a session and she was definitely right. But the way I figured it out was Googling it and like Googling, why am I having these thoughts? And OCD came up. So that was kind of my figuring it out. And then when I finally saw a therapist, she like was quick to diagnose, which is lucky for me because some therapists who don't understand OCD misdiagnose people.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you feel like your obsessive compulsive disorder affected your self-love and self-worth? And if yes, what helped you with accepting yourself fully and finding more self-love?
I literally told myself I wasn't going to cry. Like, third question. I'm not gonna cry today. It's Sunday. It did for sure because I mean, I was having all of these thoughts that were so scary. And even though I knew it was the last thing I wanted to think about, and even though I knew that it wasn't me and it was something else that I was dealing with, it made me feel like a monster. Like it made me feel like a really shitty and undeserving person. So it affected my like love for myself for a long time. And I think over time, I think I don't know exactly how it happened, but I think time just heals. And I think as I went through treatment and I really learned more about OCD and I started to advocate myself and become a therapist, that shame kind of dissipated. But it was there for a long time. And it is for a lot of people, especially people who have the more taboo obsessions.
You talk about like shame, and it's a really powerful deterrent, right?
Mhm.
It's, as you said, it was hard at the beginning speaking about, OCD and the thoughts that came with it. I feel like we all have struggled with shame, right? On one
Mhm.
way or another. Do you have any advice on how to cope with that?
Talk about it. I think there's a quote by Brene Brown that I really love, and it's something like shame grows in secrecy. So, if we
Mhm.
can talk about the things that we feel ashamed of, or maybe even the parts of ourselves that we feel shame about, I think shame tends to get more silent. Working through that, talking about it, and recognizing that a lot of shame that we feel is irrational. Like shame kind of says, I am bad. It's beyond I've done something bad. And I think a lot of us aren't actually bad at the core. We just feel really bad. So it's important to recognize that just because you're feeling shame doesn't automatically mean that you have something to be ashamed of.
So, it's really cool. And hearing you talk about it and hearing you be a voice for people has been awesome. I've been following you on Instagram, and you're really fierce in the way you use your voice.
Mhm.
Now, you're turning into a safe space for people as well, right? Is it tough being the person that has to tackle some of these really tough subjects, things that some people were like would be afraid to touch,
Mhm.
and a lot of
Yeah.
subjects, talk about sex, we talk about a lot of these compulsive thoughts. Is that tough for you being the voice? How do you manage that, being able to be that
It
person?
is. And I feel like I left the first portion of this interview thinking, like, I really hope he understood what I was talking about. Because it is really scary, even to this day, to talk about things that aren't talked about enough. But I mean, I think the support that I get on Instagram and the number of people who reach out saying that like my story has helped them or my advocacy helps them, it makes it worth it for me. And it just like this has just been a huge part of my life for the past 7 years. So it's not as difficult. I kind of forget the question, but hopefully I
It's
answered.
about being the person that has to speak about
Yeah.
tough topics, if that's something that's hard for you, and how you manage that.
Well, I think like a lot of people don't want to go there. I think some people, even in the OCD community, don't want to go there because they're afraid of what other people will think. Somebody has to go there because a lot of people live with this disorder and they live with the more taboo, intrusive thoughts. So for me, it's kind of a matter of life or death and saving lives, which is what education and advocacy does because people with OCD, there's a really high suicide rate with the disorder, and I don't want that to happen. I don't want people to suffer in silence. So I will go there, and if people judge me, then they do. But I honestly haven't, I don't think I've faced much judgment thus far.
I see that you also use your voice to express political views. Like, you are a voice for a lot of people who just feel unseen.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see yourself in that space? How do you see your voice in that regard? Like, how do you figure out what you want to use your influence on?
Yeah. So a lot of therapists don't want to go there either. A lot of therapists want to be neutral and they want to be kind of that like blank slate where clients don't know a lot about them. But for me, I think it's so important to advocate for things that matter because a lot of the clients who come into our office, like they need that advocacy. Like we need to be advocating for Black lives and for trans lives and for people who are not represented or who are marginalized, because not everybody who comes into our office is, a rich white person, if I'm being perfectly honest. And obviously, I'm white myself, so I can't speak to the experiences of marginalized folks. But I think it's so important as therapists to show that we stand with those communities because we get a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds in our office.
There's a concept about the thoughts that people have that I've really been wrestling with since our conversation, because it was hard for me to understand where you draw the line of, you know, having just thoughts that pop into your head as opposed to the ones that you obsess over, right? And so I was thinking in my head, I was like, I think about the people who, like you explained it last time, was the people who wash their hands obsessively, the stereotype that we know, right? It's usually a thought of something else. They're like, there's a bacteria that might
Mhm.
kill them, so they keep
Yes.
washing obsessively to clean that, or there's other kinds of of thoughts that are compulsive. But now I was thinking to myself, I said, well, I have a lot of thoughts sometimes that just pop in my head that I obsess over. How do you differentiate? I guess it's back to the diagnosis again. Like, how do you differentiate between
Yeah.
OCD and just having a day where you just can't get over something? You know what I mean?
So we all have intrusive thoughts. Every single human being does. We've all had that really odd thought of like, what if I just push that person in front of the bus? Or what if I punch my grandpa in the face? Like we all get those. But people with OCD have a brain that's wired differently. So the essentially the fear center in their brain is really hyperactive and the intrusive thoughts stick. So someone without OCD may be able to just kind of like have an intrusive thought and let it go, whereas the person with OCD can't because of how hyperactive their brain is. So
Mm.
it's differences in like brain structures. And it's also like the amount of time spent on obsessions and compulsions. You might get like a random intrusive thought, whereas people with OCD, the to be diagnosed, your obsessions or compulsions have to take up at least an hour of your day. So it's like time spent performing compulsions, if your, functioning is impaired, those kinds of things.
There's this concept that um, being rational and listening to your head rather than your heart is the right
Mhm.
way, right? But what about when your brain is playing tricks on you?
You
Like you have,
can't.
how does that, how does that affect someone, going with their gut decisions? Is OCD clearly separate from the daily thoughts and decisions?
So with OCD, people cannot trust their gut because essentially their gut is telling them all day long that they're in danger. Their brain is sending out false alarm danger signals when danger is not actually present. So, like, even the example of classic OCD, in which someone has contamination obsessions, like fear of germs, them just like touching their desk, their brain is firing off that they're going to die of cancer or something like that. And it's usually very irrational. So we can't trust our guts. Logic doesn't work with OCD. I always tell my clients that, like, you're never going to out logic OCD. People at their core know I'm not this person, and that's what makes it OCD. It's very opposite to what they know of themselves, but you can't use logic to rid yourself of it because it's the doubting disorder as well. If I could just say to a client, of course you're not going to die of cancer, or of course you're not going to kill your husband, we wouldn't need therapy for OCD. So you can't out logic it. You can't trust your gut. You can't trust your feelings, which is tough.
That is tough. Somebody who has something like organizational OCD,
Mhm.
right? That everything needs to be in its place. Should they be worried that they're gonna get worse and start having irrational sexual thoughts? Does that get worse over time? The different thoughts, do they start blending into other parts of your lives?
So a lot of people, like at the end of the day, I'll say this, it's all OCD. So whether someone has obsessions surrounding organization, which is not what we see typically in the media, if someone feels like everything has to be just so, it's usually because they're afraid something bad is going to happen. It's not because they just like to organize, but it's all OCD at the end of the day. And a lot of people do have different OCD themes per se. Like I'll have clients with contamination obsessions who compulsively hand wash, but also have intrusive thoughts about, I don't know, stabbing their partner. So a lot of the time, people have a variety of obsessions because OCD is kind of like whack-a-mole. When you work on one theme, another one tries to pop up.
You you actually, that's a very, so a thought like that, right? Like I'm thinking about harming a member of my family, my partner, whoever. Is it safe for me to go to that family member and tell them about this? Is it, what is that? How do
Yeah.
you advise people in that regard as well?
So I usually have clients show articles to their partner, to their family members about OCD because it's easier to digest that way and to learn about it. But usually
Mm.
the partners, I mean, not laugh because it's funny, but like usually the partners or the family members know their family member enough to recognize like this is ridiculous.
Not
But the
you.
person
Yeah.
with OCD can't see how ridiculous it is because it's so scary to them. So often I'll have like partners come in for a session just so I can do some education around it. And they're like, I know my wife's not going to stab me. Like, what is going on? It's usually not a problem.
Yeah, so that's true, because you said last time, you said that these thoughts are not your, like, it's not things that you want to do,
Mm.
right? You talked about your therapist. All right, let's go to the
Yeah.
solutions, to the treatments and therapies. You talked about your therapist being somebody that changed your life.
Mhm.
Can you tell us more about how she changed your life? And for those people who are looking to go into therapy, maybe you can maybe push them over the ledge. People that don't trust therapy, you can push
Absolutely.
them over the ledge to understanding how important it is.
Yeah. So I had two different therapists. One therapist, Lori, she's like the first ever therapist I had, and I still see her to this day. It's been like 6 years, I think. She was just like, she wasn't an OCD specialist, and she made me very aware of that. I was too afraid to see an OCD specialist for a while because the treatment I thought was going to be difficult. But from day one, she was not at all bothered by my thoughts. She knew it was OCD. She was really eager to help me get better and to treat it. I never felt like there was any judgment. And to this day, we can laugh at how ridiculous my brain is because she knows like that's just not who I am at all. So I think her non judgment and just her ability to hold space for me was really life changing. And my OCD therapist, she, I mean, her treatment was like she was a specialist. So the treatment that she utilized with me, which was exposure and response prevention, absolutely changed my life. And from then on, my symptoms really started to dissipate.
You explain. Tell me about, like, when you first started to feel your symptoms, you started getting the
My
alleviated
gosh.
symptoms.
It was the best feeling ever. I actually remember I was in New York. I think I was 23 at the time. And I just felt it one day. Like I felt like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. And it wasn't a thing that I noticed day by day. It was more like I would look back on the last year and realize that it was easier than the year before. So I always tell my clients that, like, don't look for your life to change overnight. But a year from now, you're probably going to notice how much better you feel and how much therapy has helped you.
For people who can't afford therapy,
Mm-hmm.
what are some things that one could do to help ease with the OCD symptoms?
Yeah. So I wish I could grab it, but it's too far away. There's a workbook that is really fabulous for OCD. It's called the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD by John Hirschfield and Tom Corboy. That is a really fantastic resource and it's very inexpensive. So I would say workbooks, I would say like following Instagram accounts of therapists who specialize in OCD, reading about it, learning about it, and possibly trying to do some exposure and response prevention yourself. There's online courses as well that you can take. So there definitely are options if you can't afford to see a specialist.
I call you a beast because you have taken your pain and turned it into your purpose, and your purpose being that you want to heal people and you want to
Mm-hmm.
help people with the things that you suffer with and the things that you've conquered and the things you
Mm-hmm.
continue to conquer. That is amazing in itself. Where do you see yourself in the years to come? Like, what's your goal for what you're doing, for using your voice, for being in this space and being an activist and an advocate for
Yeah.
OCD?
I know for sure that I want to write a memoir. I'm actually working on writing one right now. I'm working with someone on it, and we're about to pitch to literary agents. So fingers crossed.
Yeah.
That definitely is something that I think is really important because with memoirs, you have to be very candid. And I think it would be really helpful to people suffering. So definitely that, maybe a YouTube channel. I don't know what else, to be honest. I feel like I've lived like 15 lives already, so it's hard to think about what in the future I want to
It's
do.
really is I want to really urge you to keep going. I had this there's a sermon I heard recently. It was about there was a preacher. I actually said this to somebody else as well. There was a preacher who talked about, he said that he didn't know that what people called him would be a prison until they did. And he was talking about being a preacher and how people just expected him to stand in front of the crowds. And that was his goal. That was the thing he was supposed to do. But it turns out that making movies, writing books, doing speaking engagements outside of the church, these were just as effective just as an effective part of his ministry and helping people as standing at the church. And so I want to urge you to keep doing all these different things, all the different outlets, because there's different people you can reach in the different ways. And
Thank
so
you.
I'm really proud of you for what you're doing. And I appreciate you taking the time out to come talk to me some more. That was,
Absolutely.
yeah, thank you.
You're
Uh,
welcome.
yeah, if you got any last words for the people out there, who are loving you and who appreciate your support, yeah, you could go ahead.
Oh, I think, oh God, I can't cry today. I'm not gonna let it happen. I cry a lot, don't worry. Not today though. Just the messages that I receive on Instagram are the sweetest ever. Um, yeah, I think just, hearing people say that my story has changed their life, or there was a woman who DM'd me yesterday and said, like, I'd really like you to write out a tattoo for me because like you've changed my life in the biggest way. And that was like so massive for me to hear. So I think like people sharing their stories helps me almost as much as it, I think, helps them to hear mine. So I really love my audience. I love my followers, and I'm happy to have this community.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I feel the same way. People reaching out to me as well, and it's so inspiring to keep going because, like I
Mhm.
said earlier, like attacking these really difficult topics are tough. It's something that you have to almost prepare yourself for and go in with this armor. But then knowing
Yeah.
that people are being changed and people's lives are being affected, it gives you that extra strength to keep going through it all. So
Yeah.
thank you for being in this space. I appreciate you.
You're welcome.